Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive today. We're going to be exploring a really tough topic, but it's really important we talk about it. We're going to be looking at the refugee crisis in Libya and specifically the horrific experiences a lot of women are facing during that crisis.
Right.
We have two really important sources for this deep dive. The first one is a report and also legal filing from the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights.
The ECCHR.
That's right, the ECCHR. And the second one is a German news article that really digs into the horrifying prevalence of sexual violence along these migration routes. So before we get into the specifics of these sources, I really want to acknowledge that this is a heavy topic. Our mission today isn't to shock you with statistics or horrific stories, but rather to just try and understand the complexities of this crisis from as many different angles as possible.
Multiple perspectives.
Exactly. So before we dive into these sources, I have a question for you, the listener. When you hear the words refugees in Libya, what comes to mind?
Yeah, what's your first reaction?
Take a second to think about that. And as you're thinking about that, we're going to jump right in.
Yeah, into some pretty heavy stuff.
One of the things that really stood out to me in the German article was the story of a woman named Maria. She had disguised herself as a man for the entire journey through Sudan, the Sahara, and then into Libya.
Wow.
Now, she did this because she had heard about the dangers that women face on this journey. And she thought that this disguise would offer her some protection.
That's a common tactic.
It is. And it's really highlighted in the UNHCR report, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it actually states that for many women, sexual assault is considered an unavoidable part of their journey.
It's wild that that's just an assumption going in.
Right. It's like the level of desperation must be so high that you're willing to completely hide your identity just to feel a little bit safer.
Absolutely.
But the really heartbreaking part is, even with this disguise, Maria wasn't safe. A driver saw through her disguise and raped her while they were being transported within Libya. And he threatened to expose her if she resisted.
It's awful.
It's really, really awful. And it really highlights how dangerous every stage of this journey is for women.
Right, and it's not just limited to one particular location. It's woven into the fabric of this whole system of human trafficking and smuggling that's just emerged in Libya.
It's so easy to think, well, you know, Libya's a war-torn country. What do you expect? But the UNHCR report really emphasizes that the exploitation, it starts before Libya even enters the picture.
Yeah.
Sudan, the Sahara, these are incredibly dangerous areas, often marked by conflict and lawlessness. The journey itself just becomes this gauntlet of abuse.
It really is.
And this is where it gets even more disturbing. The German article highlights that up to 90% of women and girls on the Mediterranean route experience sexual assault.
90%.
90%. This isn't just a few isolated incidents.
Yeah.
This is a systemic issue. And it's a question that I want to pose to our listener. When you hear that statistic, 90%, what goes through your mind? Is it anger? Is it helplessness, disbelief?
Yeah, where do you even begin to address a problem of that scale?
Exactly. So hold on to that feeling as we continue our deep dive, because understanding those emotions is the first step towards actually having meaningful action and change.
It is. It's about connecting with the human side of this crisis. You know, Maria's story, that 90% statistic, those aren't just data points. They represent thousands of individual lives that have been shattered by this violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we really need to understand the context to fully grasp how dire the situation is. So the ECCHR report digs into what happened after Gaddafi's fall in 2011. Essentially, Libya descended into this chaotic state.
Yeah, a power vacuum.
A huge power vacuum. And within that vacuum, militias and all these armed groups, they started to gain power.
And they saw an opportunity.
They did. They saw an opportunity to exploit the most vulnerable people in the world. And thus, this horrific industry emerged. Human trafficking and smuggling. Vulnerable people like Maria, they essentially became commodities, exploited for profit at every stage of their journey.
So messed up. Yeah.
It is. It's really, really messed up. And it's just a cruel twist of fate. They're fleeing persecution, they're fleeing conflict, only to end up trapped in another form of exploitation.
Exactly.
And this really leads us to the situation within Libya itself. The ECCHR report goes into detail about the conditions of these Libyan detention centers. We're talking about overcrowding, a lack of basic necessities, torture, forced labor, and of course, sexual exploitation. It's almost unimaginable that these places that are meant to offer some kind of refuge actually become sites of further trauma.
That's the crazy part.
It is. And what's even more disturbing is that it's not just these random acts of violence. It's actually a calculated system of dehumanization and control. It's all driven by profit and just a complete disregard for basic human rights. It really is unreal. And it's important to remember that for many of these women, the journey doesn't end even when they reach Libyan shores. The trauma continues, and the fight for survival takes on a whole new dimension. So for our listeners, I want to ask you again, what impact does it have on you when you hear that reaching a supposed safe haven can turn into another nightmare? Just keep that thought in mind as we dive deeper into this complex situation in part 2.
It's easy to feel totally overwhelmed by the scale of this crisis, but we can't forget that these are not just statistics. We're talking about real people here.
Right. Each one of those percentage points is a woman whose life has been completely changed by this journey.
Yeah. And not just changed, irrevocably altered by what they've gone through.
That's what I keep coming back to. It's the sheer number of women affected, 90%. It's hard to wrap your head around that much suffering.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the impact, it goes way beyond the immediate physical and emotional trauma. Think about the families, the communities, their entire futures.
Right. It's like a ripple effect that just keeps spreading outwards. And that's where the work of organizations like ECCHR becomes so crucial.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They're not just offering aid, they're actually fighting for justice for these women. They're holding people accountable. They've actually filed a lawsuit with the International Criminal Court, the ICC, against Libyan officials and militia leaders.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about their legal strategy is that they're not just going after individuals. They're really trying to expose the systemic nature of these crimes against humanity.
That's huge.
It is.
Ear.
They're arguing that this isn't just a few bad actors. This is a deeply ingrained pattern of abuse within the system itself.
Makes you wonder how far that goes.
Exactly. And they're not stopping there. They've also filed a separate lawsuit against EU officials.
Or against the EU.
Against the EU.
Yeah.
Now, this might seem a little surprising at first, but their argument is that some EU policies are actually contributing to this whole cycle of abuse.
That's a bold move.
It is a bold move. They're essentially saying that the EU, by trying to prevent refugees from reaching European shores, they've actually given more power to the Libyan authorities to act without any consequences.
So they're saying the EU is basically outsourcing its border control to a country with a really bad track record on human rights.
Exactly. They're providing training and resources to the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept these boats in the Mediterranean. So it creates this moral dilemma. On the one hand, the EU is trying to prevent people from drowning in these dangerous crossings. But on the other hand, they're potentially complicit in sending those same people back to face those horrific conditions in Libyan detention centers.
You're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
It's a tough question, and I think it's one that we should pose to our listeners as well. Where do you draw the line between preventing loss of life at sea and upholding the basic human rights of those who are just seeking refuge? It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But it's a conversation that we need to have as a global community.
Definitely. We can't just brush it under the rug.
And the ECCHR, they're not afraid to call out these uncomfortable truths. They're directly challenging this narrative that the EU is just trying to save lives.
And how are they doing that?
Well, they've actually meticulously documented cases of refugees being intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard and then forcibly returned to Libya, where they face detention and abuse. They're building their case with hard evidence using international law to back up their claims.
It's not just an emotional argument.
It's not just an emotional argument. It's a really well-researched legal challenge. And this lawsuit against the EU, it's unprecedented. So it's hard to say what the chances of success are.
Yeah, international legal cases can drag on for years and years.
They can. But regardless of the outcome, ECCHR has already achieved something really significant. They've brought international attention to this dire situation in Libya. And they've forced a much-needed debate about the EU's role in all of this.
Sometimes just raising the right questions is a victory in itself.
I think you're absolutely right. It's about shedding light on the unintended consequences of policies that might have started with good intentions. And that's where public awareness comes in. It's not just about these legal battles. It's about changing the narrative. It's about raising awareness and demanding accountability from our leaders.
Yeah, getting people talking about it is huge.
It is. So as we move into the final part of this deep dive, I'm really curious to know what's resonating with our listeners so far. What's stuck with you? What sparked your interest? Maybe what's motivating you to actually take action? Think about that as we wrap things up in part 3. We've really spent this whole deep dive unpacking this horrific reality, this refugee crisis in Libya, especially for women. It's really a stain on our collective conscience. But even amidst all of this darkness, there are glimmers of hope.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to remember. It'd be easy to get lost in all the statistics and the suffering and feel like nothing can be done. But what ECCHR is doing, both with direct aid and these landmark legal cases, it really shows that change is possible.
It really does. It's a reminder that even when things seem so bleak, there are people who are refusing to turn away. They're fighting for justice, for accountability, and ultimately for a world where these horrors that Maria endured aren't just considered an unavoidable part of seeking refuge.
Yeah, it's not just the way it is, something can be done.
Exactly. And I think their lawsuit against EU officials is particularly interesting. It brings up these really complex questions about responsibility, about unintended consequences of policies that may have started with good intentions. It forces us all to look in the mirror and examine our own roles, even if we're thousands of miles away.
Yeah, nobody's off the hook.
Nobody's off the hook. And I keep thinking back to that question we asked our listeners. Where do you draw the line between preventing loss of life at sea and upholding basic human rights? It's such a tough question to grapple with.
It is. It's like walking a moral tightrope.
Exactly. And there are no easy answers. But what ECCHR is doing is they're really trying to start a deeper conversation about the ethical implications of these border control policies. They're not just pointing fingers, they're demanding accountability from the entire international community.
They're saying we can't just pretend this isn't happening.
Right. It's not just happening over there. It's happening because of decisions that are being made in boardrooms and government offices all over the world. And this is where individual action comes in. It's about staying informed, having these difficult conversations, supporting organizations like ECCHR who are fighting for change, recognizing that we each have a role to play.
And it's not about being a superhero or anything. It's about those little things, those daily choices.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of that quote from Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. It might feel like a drop in the ocean, but every voice raised against injustice, every donation, every conversation, it creates a ripple effect.
It all adds up.
It really does. And this crisis in Libya, the stories of women like Maria, it's all incredibly overwhelming. But we can't give in to despair. We have a moral obligation to act, to speak up for those who can't, to demand better for those who have already suffered so much.
We owe it to them.
We do. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this final thought. What are you going to do today, tomorrow, next week, to contribute to a world where seeking refuge doesn't automatically mean facing exploitation and abuse?
It's in your hands.
The answer lies within each of us. Thanks for joining us on Deep Dive.